Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this live stream conversation with Elizabeth Kolbert. I'm Ariana Brocious. We're recording today's conversation for the Climate One radio show and podcast that publishes every Friday. You can subscribe wherever you get your pods and tune in. If you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, you might be interested in a whole week of live events we're planning at the Commonwealth Club during SF Climate Week. That's April 22nd through the 25th. In-person guests will include California Attorney General Rob Bonta on suing big oil, plus State Senators Scott Wiener and Nancy Skinner, and Lieutenant Governor Eleni Koulounakis, and more. You can head over to our website, climateone.org, to get more details and to get advance tickets. If you have questions for our guests today, you can submit them in the comments section of the live stream, and we will aim to get to those at the end. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the new essay collection, H is for Hope, Climate Change from A to Z, Elizabeth Kolbert. Elizabeth, welcome to Climate One.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'm very excited for today's conversation. We have a lot to talk about. So some of your earliest climate reporting began in the early 2000s when you took a trip to a weather station on a Greenland ice sheet. Those stories became your 2006 book, Field Notes from a Catastrophe. I've never had the privilege or adventure of going to Greenland. Can you describe what it's like to be on an ice sheet there?
Well, it's really as close as you can get, I think, without leaving planet Earth to being on another planet. It's a very sort of otherworldly experience. If you're actually on the top of the ice sheet, it's just white snow in all directions, just this vast expanse of white. If you're sort of closer to the edge of the ice sheet, then it's a little bit more nerve-wracking, I suppose, because there are crevasses and all sorts of features to the ice, and that becomes they're beautiful. They can be very beautiful. There can be these huge melt streams that are this fantastic color blue, and these moulins, which are these just holes that develop in the ice where these water just drops many thousands of feet. But those can be, being near one, and I have been very near one, is a bit nerve-wracking, as you can imagine.
Yeah, and so you're describing changes maybe. I mean, I'm curious, you've been back several times since that first trip. What changes have you observed? I mean, have you seen sort of with your own eyes the impacts of climate change?
Well, I don't want to, say that I've seen with my own eyes because I'm not a native Greenlander, but the Greenlanders whom you speak to will tell you there are immense changes that they have seen in the course of, just the last couple of decades. And I'll give you one example. There's a town called Ilulissat, which is on Greenland's west coast, and it's at the outlet of this large ice stream. It's where these huge icebergs break off, fantastically beautiful. And two things that people in that town have noticed. First off, that the icebergs, which are still quite huge, have gotten smaller over time. Their elevation has just dropped, so their size has dropped. And secondly, this huge bay, it's called Disco Bay, used to freeze over in the winter, and people ran dog sleds over it. And now it doesn't freeze. And so that's a huge change, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Well, you personally, like many of us, have begun to witness some of these changes in your own neck of the woods. What have you seen from your home in terms of changing impacts, changing seasons?
Well, anyone, who's lived pretty much anywhere for a couple decades now, or even a couple of years, it sometimes seems, can see big changes. What I've seen, in the Berkshires, I live in Western Massachusetts, in an area where we have a lot of ski resorts. They're having, tremendous trouble because the snow just is the season even of making snow. So a lot of these snow resorts used to run on natural snow, which would be really impossible these days. And even the window for making snow has really crunched down to a very small window. The maple sugaring is a big, I don't want to say it's a big industry, but it's a lot of people maple sugar where I live. That window where you need these freezing nights and warmer days, there's always a pretty small window for sugaring, but now it's just moved up so that it happens now. It used to happen in, April, and now can happen in the end of February this year. So people have seen, just really really big changes in seasonality. And that's just true everywhere. Anywhere you go, you could find them if you were looking for them.
Yeah, we've been hearing those stories on the show for the last several years, people really beginning to kind of understand that this isn't happening in the future, it's happening right now. Um, you're a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, and lately you've written about rising sea temperatures, unprecedented natural disasters like Hurricane Otis, and the ecological consequences of extractive industries. And to be totally frank, a lot of your reporting is a harsh dose of reality for where we are in this climate moment. And I'm curious how you hope your work lands with readers.
Well, I guess I'd say I subscribe, to a pretty old-fashioned view of journalism, which is that the journalist's job is really to report on what's going on, and it's his or her job is not to tell you how to feel about it, or not to even think about that. Really, it's just to report the facts to the best of their ability. And so I guess that's what I'm reporting on, the facts to the best of my ability.
Yeah, I think a bit later we may touch on sort of the complexities. We've had recent conversations with people about how their thoughts on whether that's still an effective strategy when it comes to climate. And I would like to ask you about that. But I want to get into your new book, H is for Hope. So let's start there. This is an abecedary, which is, each letter stands for a word. It's a totally different format than your other climate books, which are longer journeys made by following scientists around. This one is a short collection of essays on different aspects of the climate crisis that connect to each other in a really nice, longer narrative. So I'm curious why you took this format that differs so much from some of your past work.
Well, I was really trying to do a few things simultaneously, and one of which was to sort of reanimate this story. I do think there's a way that people, sort of, as you were alluding to, sort of turn away from climate stories. They feel like they've read them before. What is there new to say? So sort of trying to break that story open, and catch people off guard a little bit, I guess. But the other inspiration for it was that, climate change is just such a huge story. It's not one story. If you follow even a really great, important climate change story to its end, you've only told one strand of this almost infinitely stranded story. And so I wanted to try to bring more of those strands together, and this seemed like a way to do that.
And is part of the goal to be more accessible, maybe for readers who are daunted by a longer book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope that you could read this book, which is very beautifully illustrated by Wesley Alsbrook, and come away once again in a pretty short sitting with a pretty good sense of the whole landscape. Yeah, which I think is hard to acquire these days without no one's reading, no lay person is really reading the scientific literature, and without reading several books on this topic. I like to think you could get a pretty good sort of quick background on climate change.
I think that's true. There's a lot, and there's a lot of contemporary reporting in here too. So I want to chat about a couple of these vignettes. Electrify Everything, this is the letter E, details the plummeting costs and massive expansion of renewable energy and describes a not so distant future where the US runs on carbon-free electricity. With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, electrifying our grid and all of our homes and cars is becoming much more possible. Then you have a later chapter, Q for Quagmire, which details the extensive problems and complexities with our current electric grid and permitting. So I'm curious, you mentioned this, multifaceted or kind of multi-strand um, nature of climate, but how do you reconcile those two states of affairs?
Well, I think there is no one that really does get back to the basic issue here. And I think at one point in the book, I say it's to say that enormous strides are being made and to say that almost nothing has been done, both are true. And that is another, sort of message of the book. I think there's a tendency to want to tell one story that has a very clear, either we're doomed or we're going to be saved. These things stories tend to fall into one of those modes. And I think that the, truth, the awkward truth, the uncomfortable truth is that all of these truths are true at the same time.
Right. So another pairing, if you'll allow me, of some vignettes is leapfrogging. So this covers the potential for parts of the world with who have severe energy poverty to basically skip over fossil fuels entirely and move to a more resilient, ideally carbon-free system of electricity. Then the chapter Shortfall describes the vast inequality baked into the climate crisis and the fact that the nations who've put most of the carbon in the atmosphere, the US, Europe, Canada, are not meeting their own carbon reduction targets and also very slow currently to commit money to help poorer nations adapt. So, how can poor countries leapfrog over fossil fuel dependence without the means to invest in those alternatives?
Well, that's sort of the great, question of our time. And this idea that, there's so much inequality baked into the climate crisis, as you say, and you can't really say that people who have not contributed very much to the problem, but who very much want to develop and reach a better standard of living, which in the way that at least it's been conceived in the global north is very energy intensive. So I think India is a very good example of this. Now the most populous country in the world, relatively low contributor to historical emissions, but emissions growing very, very fast. So if you were sort of, the world as a whole, and you said, what would be the sort of cheapest, best alternative for the world, you'd say, well, India, we should all invest in India so that India doesn't follow the same development path that the US and Europe and China followed, which were very fossil fuel intensive. It would be in everyone's interest to avoid those emissions. And that would be the cheapest way to avoid those emissions. But getting the world, to agree to that and invest in another country's development has turned out to be extremely difficult, bordering on impossible.
Right. We've seen the creation of a loss and damage fund at one of the recent conference of parties, and there's been, I think, perhaps some money allocated to that, but it is slow. It's not happening at the pace that's needed.
Yeah, no, the loss and damage fund has very little funding at this point. But if you go back, there were previous funds, that were supposed to reach various, points of funding and arguably have never reached what they were supposed to reach, or you can argue long and hard about what funding should count, what funding hasn't counted, and believe me, people have argued about that. But I think the basic point that this is very capital intensive. Investing in clean energy, I mean, the good news is once you've put the capital in, then the fuel, quote unquote fuel, which is either the wind or the sun, let's say, is free. But the capex, as it's called, the upfront costs are very high, and that's particularly difficult for countries that don't have that kind of cash.
Right, right. So I really enjoyed reading this book. It has a real narrative arc and flow, and I was reading along until I hit
Thank
chapter D. You're welcome. D for despair, and it really just stopped me as a reader on the page because unlike the other chapters, this one only has 2 lines, one on each page. Despair is unproductive. It is also a sin. So tell me about your thinking behind this and that effect it has of kind of making you, as a reader, stop and the choice to make it so different from the rest of the vignettes.
Well, I think one of the advantages of this format was it allowed me to break the narrative in a way. And so I actually wrote those first 4 letters before, just in kind of a rush, and got pretty quickly to D for despair. And then that's sort of a moment in the narrative for a reset. But despair is a constant theme in climate conversations and climate coverage. And it's a pretty logical, response to the actual facts and the numbers. But it doesn't get us anywhere. So the point of the book was just not the point of the book, but the point of that entry, I guess, was to acknowledge that as a legitimate and, perhaps inevitable point that you reach, but to get beyond that.
Right. And so the title of the book is H is for Hope. And then there is this chapter on despair. And you've said that it doesn't matter how we feel about it. It matters what we do, right? But we do feel, and we all feel, and it can be really overwhelming to contemplate the scale of what needs to happen and how little we've actually accomplished. So how do you personally balance those competing things of kind of hope and despair?
Well, I never in any way hold myself up as a model of, what other people should be doing. And that's both, psychically and, practically. And, I wouldn't say that I have a good answer. And the last year, I think, has really challenged even those who would like to be hopeful. Just the data that are coming in are really scary. They're very scary. There's just no other way to put it. So I do live in a, I like all people, I guess I live on many levels and in a very long-term and, 30,000 foot level, I feel very worried for my kids, very worried for the world. And on a day-to-day level, like everyone else, I, go about my business and live the life of right now.
Yeah, I think that's something extremely relatable.
And maybe that's the problem, to be honest, that we're all doing that, because what we really need is to be, just doing nothing but sort of focusing on what we need to be, doing the actions. And it's very hard to get the world's attention long enough. There's always another crisis that's intervening.
Well, and there's the simple fact that it can, it's just, we all have these priorities. Those of us who are in the more comfortable parts of the world are accustomed to that level of comfort. And the idea of changing it, there's this, I think, often false assumption that addressing climate means sacrificing, means having to give up things, instead of maybe just tweaking them to a different way, which is the case in many circumstances. And so, yeah, it's a pretty complex area. We've talked a lot about it on Climate One, and I think you, as someone who's covered it for so long, I'm curious. This has been at least 2 decades you've spent covering climate change. And you recently wrote an article in the New Yorker about last year's Canadian wildfires. And you wrote, "The unusual soon became the unheard of." So how do you grapple with this sort of unprecedented, and even the term unprecedented, this new era that we're finding ourselves in when covering climate?
Well, I think that is the really, terrifying aspect of it. And I don't think it's, widely appreciated enough, although maybe as more and more of these unprecedented disasters strike, more and more people are really coming, up close and personal with the unprecedented. I think we lucked into, we now know, we can look at the climate of the last really 10,000 years in great detail. And we know that this moment in which all of what we would call, civilization has existed is a moment of unusual climate stability in the whole, climate record and the climate record of the last several 100,000 years. And now we are heading into, and I say this without fear of contradiction, a time of climate instability. And it's not at all clear, what the limits on that are. We just are when you jack up the CO2 in the atmosphere the way we have, which really has, possibly never happened before in the history of the world, that so much CO2 has been released so quickly. You don't know exactly what the impacts are going to be. And they could be sort of off the charts in ways that we can't even anticipate. Scientists can't even, exactly anticipate. So I think you are, there was a famous saying from Wally Broker, who was a very important climate scientist. Climate is an angry beast, and we are poking it with a stick. We don't know The honest truth, I think, would be we don't know exactly what the climate system has in store for us. We can be pretty sure it has some pretty bad stuff in store for us, but it could be even worse than many of the modeling studies suggest. And I think climate scientists, particularly in the course of this past year, when we've seen record after record after record fall, are starting to think some pretty, are we missing something in these models maybe? And that is very, it's just very scary. The unknown is very scary when you have 8 billion people on the planet who are sort of dependent on the climate as we know it.
Right. And another theme of this latest book and a lot of your writing is this sort of tipping points, right? And that there's these kind of feedback loops where we may hit a certain point, and others have written about this too. And then all of a sudden it's like we've passed a certain, level of change and entered into a wholly new arena. And that is really scary. I mean, we don't know yet, right? Exactly when that might happen or.
Yes, I think there's more and more attention on these, tipping points, these points at which feedbacks in the climate system, it doesn't matter what we do at that point, these internal feedback loops will take over. And when I, 20 years ago was first covering climate change, Richard Alley, a glaciologist from Penn State, gave me this analogy. You are on a rowboat, you rock the boat, it goes back to the same state. You rock it again, it goes back to the same state. And you rock it enough, and you get to another state, which is upside down, which is also stable. That's another stable state. So that's the big question. A lot of these systems that we, once again, depend on unknowingly have quite possibly 2 stable states. And we could be pushing some of them into the new stable state, with which humanity just has no, certainly not in recorded history, has no experience with that.
Mm-hmm.
And really probably has no experience as a species. We're not actually a very old species even. So there's probably, we're probably pushing the climate out of the state it has been since we as a species evolved.
Right. So in this 2 decades that you've been covering climate or sounding the alarm on climate, how has the response changed?
Well, I think, the good news is that I think there's just much, much, much more awareness of climate change. When I, first started out, it was possible to find a lot of scientists, field scientists, who would say to you, well, I'm not really seeing climate change, and I'm not convinced that these models are correct. Now, if you go back and talk to some of these same people, and I have gone back and talked to some of these same people, they were like, oh yeah, absolutely, I'm seeing it in the field. There's absolutely no doubt of what's going on. And I think that's true of the general public as well. Once again, it's just very difficult to avoid the signs of climate change these days. Everyone and many, sort of ordinary activities, as we were discussing, you used to go skate on that pond, you used to sled down that hill. Those are just not happening anymore. So you don't have to be, much more than, my kids, they're 25 years old. They remember sledding in the backyard. That was just a big wintertime activity. Very unusual that you can do that these days. So
Right.
I think, you don't have to be a weatherman, to know which way the wind is blowing.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. So I want to return to something that we touched on earlier, which is kind of the role of a journalist and how you view that in terms of communicating information. When Climate One co-host Greg Dalton interviewed you on this show back in 2017, you said that solving this problem, climate disruption, climate change, is above your pay grade, and that you hope to inspire people to think about it, but you can't take responsibility for what they do with the information. We had a recent episode where we discussed this idea of a information deficit model of climate communication and how it may be insufficient since we've tried it for the last however many years and haven't seen a significant change in how people are necessarily responding to or perceiving of the problem. So at this point in your career, are you still convinced that that's the best path forward?
Well, I think, there are all sorts of ways to communicate climate change. I wouldn't say that, journalists, there should be, advertising campaigns. There should be a lot of other things going on. But I think as a journalist, I mean, once again, I just don't know. I don't have the ability. I don't have the resources, to be honest, to, test drive messages to go out there and say, well, would this story work? Would that story work? We're just not equipped to do that. We're, sort of barely equipped at this point to get the information out. And, the information deficit model, once again, that's being challenged on all fronts, and not to get into contemporary politics, but, how you get out information and whether the information, there's so many forces muddying the message these days for many times, often highly motivated reasons. It's not entirely clear to me that we have adequately tested the information deficit model, because there's a lot, there's still a lot of information deficit, but even if I had, very clear evidence that that was not the way to communicate this message to motivate action, I still wouldn't have the means to come up with a different way to do journalism. And, I still think there's a function for the truth, even if the truth is not what is going to get us from A to B.
Yeah, I echo that. There's definitely a role for the truth.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
curious.
something we can all, I hope, get behind, but I'm not sure.
We've talked with some people who began their careers as scientists and reached a point of frustration and disillusionment so much that they switched to becoming an activist. And I'm curious if you've ever contemplated that, if there's, a point you've reached personally where you think, okay, yeah, I need a different method, maybe.
I do sometimes get to that point, and I think I have thought, what else could I be doing? But I do think you also have to, the old, to thine own self be true. You have to know what your own talents and abilities are. I don't necessarily think I'd make a very good activist or very good. So, those scientists who decided to either abandon, traditional science or, modify what they're doing, I applaud them, if they feel like they are doing more good that way. I just don't think that that's my own personal strength. So I guess I, keep doing what I'm doing now. I suppose people have defined insanity as doing what you're doing, expecting a different outcome. I no longer expect a different outcome, but I still, as I say, cling to that idea that the truth matters.
Yeah. You won a Pulitzer Prize for your book, The Sixth Extinction, and the world has gone through several mass extinctions over its 4.5 billion years. The fifth was that of the dinosaurs. And you say that humans are causing the world's sixth, and that as many as half the world's species could be headed for extinction by mid-century. But you also write about how humans reached Australia 50,000 years ago and wiped out species like the wombat, rhinoceros. So humans have been altering the world for a long time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence is pretty compelling that what's called the megafauna extinction, which was this sort of, you could call it a wave, or you could call it multiple waves of extinction of very large animals. It was very selective against large, slow to reproduce animals that hit first Australia, then the Americas, then places like Madagascar, as humans settled in new places. So I think there's very good evidence that, already 50, 60,000 years ago, humans were causing extinctions. I don't think that's, I mean, it is still debated, but I don't think it's really debatable.
Well, the pace and scale has changed, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, those animals that humans wiped out, presumably predominantly through hunting, that might have taken, when we look back 50,000 years, we don't get very good resolution. It perhaps took, thousands of years to drive the megafauna of Australia extinct. Nowadays, we are watching many species go extinct in real time. I mean, I've spoken to, in the course of reporting the sixth extinction, I spoke to many scientists who had watched on their own watch, they'd started out studying X or Y, and it had disappeared, in the course of watching, of doing their dissertation research. So yes, the speed has increased, the rate has increased, and the sheer number and multiple classes of organisms that are being affected has, shot up.
I think that's partly what motivated Christiana Figueres, right, who's a very notable climate advocate, was the loss of a certain frog in her native Costa Rica. I think it might have been something that caught her attention and it got her connected to climate.
Yes, I once did a profile of Christiana. She's a really wonderful woman, and she's she's back in Costa Rica and living in Costa Rica and very connected to the wonderful, fauna of Costa Rica.
Yeah. Um, I can think also to the bison, right, which were a species that we very purposefully decimated in a very, very short amount of time. And that's a tragic history, one that really pains me to think about. And also, I think today, what's maybe more, I don't know, what I think is more, it's what's more distressing is the fact that there's all these losses that we are unaware of. They're happening beyond, we don't even have a sense of the number of how many, what the losses are that are stacking up. And I don't know that there's a way to even communicate that to a person who maybe has grown up in a city and not ever even experienced the incredible biodiversity that exists in some parts of the world.
Yeah, I think that is part of, this complicated cycle that we're in, where people, are living in places where, most of the native fauna and flora was, already, well, first of all, many of us live, I live in a part of the world, that was glaciated, as recently as, probably 12,000 years ago. So it would be considered a very, sort of depauperate landscape, with whatever's there has just come back in the last, 10,000 years or so. And, part of the amazing privilege, really, of writing The Sixth Extinction was going to parts of the world that, most Americans don't get to, where, these so-called biodiversity hotspots, which are really where the tremendous biodiversity of the world resides, in places like, the Amazon. So the disconnect, we're sort of already disconnected on some level, because many of us live in parts of the world that were not particularly biodiverse to begin with, and then we live in cities where the native fauna has, been wiped out a long time ago, or displaced a long time ago. How's that? And then we increasingly live, indoors and on our screens, and not really in touch with the outside. And there's been a lot of talk about, do kids have any relationship to the outdoors anymore? So as you lose those connections, then, the fact that some once common species is gone, potentially even goes, I don't want to say goes unnoticed, because, probably someone out there is noticing, but I sort of unremarked upon.
Just a quick note to viewers that if you have questions, please put those in the live stream chat, and we'll try to get to those in a few minutes here. So just another point on this extinction thread. In each of the previous mass extinctions, 75 to 85% of all life forms on Earth went extinct in a relatively short time. Do you think humans are going to make the cut of this next wave?
Well, that clearly remains to be seen. I mean, if you define a major mass extinction, and that is, as you say, the definition, basically 3/4 of the species on Earth being wiped out. That's fortunately a high bar to reach. We are, nowhere near that at this point. But if you look at the forces that we have put into play, and it kind of depends how long are we at this enterprise of transforming the world. And I think one of the important points to make, and it is another, complexity or wrinkle, I suppose, on fighting climate change. Some of the very, if sort of solutions that are proposed, or ameliorative measures that are proposed, are very land intensive, for example. So Are you going to plant forests to soak up carbon? Are those going to be the kind of forests that the native wildlife need? Are you going to put down many square miles of solar panels to generate clean energy? Is that going to displace a lot of the creatures that were living in those many square miles? So there are no easy ways out at this point. I think that is unfortunately the case.
Many years ago, I read a book called The World Without Us by Alan Weisman, and it was this thought experiment of if humans just vanished one day, um, how long it would take nature essentially to kind of reclaim what we've done. And it was really interesting. And one particular anecdote that stands out was like the subway system, I think in New York, and how quickly it would flood and, become totally clogged with roots or the things that we have to do to actually keep them functioning, pumping out the water and so forth. And um, obviously, that's not an outcome any of us are looking for, but it is an interesting way to view things, and I think can give us some perspective that though we feel really powerful, and I think you comment on this in this latest book, this sort of hubris that we have as humans and our ability to control the world, that there is a limit, right? There's a limit to what we can do without probably resulting in our own extinction.
Well, I think that we have, one of our immense talents, or maybe our true immense talent is, we're very creative and very resourceful as a species. And that's why, that's how we got to this point. That's why there are 8 billion people on the planet. That's a lot of human biomass just to support. And, whether that experiment, it's sort of an experiment, can continue is, at this level is really, an open question. We are running many years ago, one of the Roger Revelle, one of the very first people to sort of understand the significance of climate change back in the late 50s, said, we are running a vast experiment which could never have been run before and will not be run again. We only have one planet Earth, and in multiple ways, we keep finding this. I mean, microplastics are a really good example. Well, we just did it. We just decided to make a lot of plastics, and that seemed like a good idea at the time, but maybe it wasn't. And now there's no way to get rid of all that plastic that's on the planet. So we just keep doing this. We just keep running these experiments. Let's see what happens. And when you think about it, just on a kind of gut level, well, yeah, maybe it works the first time and the second time and the third time and the fourth time, but one of those times is probably going to have some pretty serious consequences, and we're certainly seeing that with our experiment of using fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. So what do you most want readers and our listeners today to understand about where we're at in this moment in the climate emergency?
Well, you've sort of summed it up. I mean, we are in an emergency. If I were just speaking, one-on-one with our listeners, we are in an emergency. I do think it's important that people understand that, because I think that it changes your reaction to various measures that are proposed. If you say, well, that's, as Al Gore famously put it, that would be inconvenient. It would be inconvenient to do X or Y. You do have to measure that against the alternatives. What are the alternatives? So we've often had this conversation like, well, I don't want to do this. We don't want to do this. We don't want to do that. But the alternative, everyone has to realize is change is coming. Change is coming at us in a big way. And we can try to manage that change, or we can let, it sort of manage us. So that is the sort of big message. I think from the book's perspective, the message that I want to leave people with, I would say it's not really a message book. It's a book about looking at this problem, this issue from multiple different perspectives, the perspectives of Americans, the perspective of non-Americans, and, introducing a lot of the many complexities of the issues without, I hope, leaving people feeling completely overwhelmed. I'd like to say there's, I hope, and part of the point of doing it as an illustrated book too, was, I hope a certain amount of fun and pleasure in reading the book, even though the subject matter is obviously very heavy.
There is. And I think you do walk that, you kind of weave back and forth between more of the heavy things and some of the lighter things. So one of the chapter that I think it's H for Hope that really I found interesting was the iron rust batteries technology, which I hadn't even heard of, and fascinating possibilities there. So that's, a little moment of
Yeah, and that company that I wrote about, so H is for Hope, there's, a section about, many great new technologies that are being developed. And that company that I sort of did a mini profile of in that section, Form Energy, is building a plant, even as we speak, in West Virginia to manufacture these huge batteries that rely on this idea that rust runs in one direction, but you can run it back in the other direction with energy that you have a sort of excess energy. Like if you have a wind farm, for example, some days you just have excess energy that you can't put on the grid. You can run these batteries. You can store a lot of energy in these massive iron air batteries. And then when you need that energy, you can basically let the stuff rust again and run that process and get the energy back out. So it's quite fascinating, and it's actually happening.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to turn to a couple questions from our audience. Barbara, who's watching on the live stream, asks what you think about academic professional associations' resistance to naming this period as the Anthropocene. And she notes that it's sad to see scientists naming this reality.
I think it's been a really, interesting debate over, it's been a somewhat in the academic circles, it's been a somewhat technical debate. Should we formally call this the Anthropocene? Stratigraphers who are, their own breed, let's put it that way, have, decided not to take a vote. Just the other week, decided not to go forward with that in a formal sense. But the word Anthropocene is not going anywhere. And the basic idea that humans are now, a dominant or the dominant force on planet Earth, rivaling what were, quote unquote, great forces of nature, that's not going anywhere.
Yeah. Another question from Peggy asks, what is your thought on the viability of efforts to preserve species in protected settings like zoos and reserves in the hope they can be reintroduced later into the wild? And this is something you might touch on in your book, Under a White Sky.
Yeah, I think that we have more and more species that are there's a term for it. They're called conservation reliant. They require human intervention of some kind. We're either talking about feeding, or we're talking about keeping predators away, keeping introduced predators away. There's a million different ways, not a million, but many different ways in which we do this. And the justification is often, well, let's keep this species alive, and hopefully, we hope that one day this condition that's keeping it conservation reliant will be solved or ameliorated, and that species will once again thrive on its own. I think if you talk to the people who are doing the work, they will say we often, in many cases, realize that's a faint hope, but we still think that keeping this species alive is better than letting it disappear. And I have to agree with them.
Yeah, it seems a hopeless enterprise to sort of give up when we don't have to give up yet, right?
Exactly.
Bruce asks, what do you think of various geoengineering schemes being contemplated? Are they just ploys by the fossil fuel industry to prop up continued use of fossil fuels?
Well, I think I'll just for the sake of, don't mean to be too pedantic, but there are geoengineering.
There's many geoengineering schemes.
There's many geoengineering. And sometimes what's called carbon dioxide removal is lumped with geoengineering. Sometimes it's taken as its own thing. What's often used sort of informally as geoengineering is this idea that we're going to spray some reflective material in the stratosphere, and that's going to reflect sunlight back to space, and that's going to have a cooling effect that will offset or partially offset the effect of dumping all the CO2 into the lower atmosphere. And I think that all of those ideas, certainly the idea of carbon dioxide removal, about which you're going to hear more and more, is often a diversion from the real problem, which is just we should stop emitting CO2. And once we get to the point where we've really radically reduced our carbon emissions, we can start worrying about carbon dioxide removal. But until then, I don't think it makes sense. But a lot of money and a lot of effort is going into it right now, and there is already a lot of carbon dioxide removal sort of baked into these scenarios that, we're supposed to keep us below 1.5 degrees, clearly are not going to keep us below 1.5 degrees. But even the scenarios to keep us below 2 degrees often have a lot of carbon dioxide removal in them. And as for stratospheric geoengineering, we're in this sort of schizophrenic moment right now where there's really no actual experimentation going forward. In fact, there was one tiny little experiment that had been planned out of Harvard that was just canceled. I just got the announcement for that. But there's a lot more and more talk about geoengineering because as the folks who study it will tell you, there's really no other way. If you suddenly decide you don't like the climate that you have, no one has come up with a quick way of changing that except for using stratospheric geoengineering. And no one really knows if stratospheric geoengineering would work, but that's the only idea even that's out there. So I think that idea is unfortunately also not going away.
Yeah, and for viewers or listeners, there's a Climate One episode from a couple years ago where we explore this because it's very complicated. And as you say, there are people very strongly opinionated on both sides, and those who are researching it want to be able to test it. That's how you test science, right? But there are many who question even testing it is already further along the path than they want to go with it. So yeah, it's a quite complex subject. As we wrap up here, when we talked before, you said quite plainly that you do get tired of covering climate. Who wouldn't, right? How do you take care of yourself, given that this is, you're living the job you do day in and day out?
Well, I mean, I think that, there are at this point thousands and thousands of people who are working on climate change pretty much, full time. So I'm not exceptional, in any way. It is something that, haunts your days and nights. How's that? But I guess I'd say there's a lot of people on planet Earth right now who have, very, very are facing very acute crises and war and famine and, terrible emergencies. So I don't think it is productive or justified, for me to in any way, feel sorry for myself because I'm thinking about, climate change. That's a sort of anyone could be haunted by climate change, and many, I think increasingly many people are. That's why we have this whole term,
Yes.
Climate anxiety. So, just count me among the climate anxious.
Yeah, and I also want to allow for the fact that it's okay. I mean, you can only live in your own experience, right? And it doesn't discount the suffering and experience of others that's happening now. And also, the reason that many of us are anxious is because we anticipate much more suffering. So, there's real reason behind it. So,
No, absolutely. I'm not in any way discouraging people from feeling anxious. Believe me, I wish, honestly, more. I know that anxiety, has a bad name, as it were, but I do think anxiety is a big motivator. We should be, we should be anxious, and we should be motivated by that anxiety. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for today. Elizabeth Kolbert is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of the new essay collection, H is for Hope, Climate Change from A to Z. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'd like to give a shout out.